Hey guys, this is Sola here. Got a pretty interesting match today. This is gonna be against Miracles, and I thought I'd go ahead and go over it, um, as it just was a pretty good take on Miracles. I think just kind of shows how I think the game should be played from the burn side of the table. We did end up winning the die roll, and we have a pretty good opening hand here. I mean, against just about anything in the format, this is looking about right. We've got 2 recurring sources of damage, so even if they do have a removal spell, we do have the secondary Swift Spear to start hitting in. We have Price of Progress, which is often one of our best cards in our deck, and we've got 2 Rift Bolts to kind of fill the curve with. So we'll go ahead and keep this. Our opponent leads on an island and a ponder, which is usually going to be Miracles. They decided not shuffle the library. They kept their opening 7, so it's pretty safe to assume that they've probably got some way to deal with the Swift Spear on top of their deck. We're going to go ahead and run out the other Swift Spear and suspend a Rift Bolt. Go ahead and attack in for another 2 points of damage here. So if you look at our hand, including the Rift Bolt that's on suspend, we've got 10 guaranteed points of damage, basically, and he's at 17. If we can continue to hit with these Swift Spears, that's going to be a lot more damage. So next turn, that will be another 4. And that will put them down to 13, and then the 3 off the Rift Bolt puts them down to 10. The Price of Progress can force them to crack fetch lands, so that if they put something with a if they don't have a Brainstorm in hand, you can kind of ruin their fetch land, or like with a Brainstorm on the stack, you can use Price of Progress to make them ruin their Brainstorm, basically, or take the 2 damage. Price of Progress also is likely to do at least 2 damage at some point, because they'll probably go get a Tundra. But you can't really consider Price of Progress as a source of damage just yet. The good news is they just played a red source, which means the Price of Progress is much more likely to do some sort of damage in this game because they still don't have a white source yet. And if they don't have a white fetch, they won't be able to go get a basic Plains. So we trigger Prowess, Rift Bolt comes off. You'll notice here he chose not to use Counterbalance's ability. So we can kind of infer a few different things about his build of deck based on that. The first one would be that he probably doesn't have Monastery Mentor in his deck, or he has both of them in hand already. Monastery Mentor is one of the few 3-drops that they'll be able to run in the main deck, and the fact that he didn't try to like blind flip a Mentor off the top. Actually, I don't know if he even got that deep with Ponder yet, so that's actually a different reason that I'm thinking of. I was thinking that it might prove that he doesn't have Mentor in his deck, but he probably knew it was on top of his deck just from Ponder. So we're going to go ahead and run out the Goblin Guide. We might as well see what's on top of his deck. If he blind flips a 1-drop, that's fine. If not, it's just a ton of damage. There's not really a time that we're going to be able to sneak this Goblin Guide in very reliably. So we'll suspend the other Rift Bolts. Go ahead and hit him down for another 4 points. These Swift Spears have done so much damage to him. It's pretty incredible for just the 1 mana investment we've put into them. He's going to go ahead and cast a Brainstorm here. He does have the basic Plains. We know that he has Swords to Plowshares in hand because that's what he revealed off the top with his Counterbalance. And instead he's taking in a more greedy line here with his Engineered Explosives. He's already played his land for the turn, and he hasn't played his Engineered Explosives with his blue mana or his red mana from his Volcanic Island. Instead he's chosen to play it with his white mana, basically meaning that he either has Lightning Bolt in his deck, and maybe he has one in hand, or that he's planning on not using this mana at all, and instead just going to be able to try to use 2 mana next turn for this Engineered Explosives to deal with our Swift Spears. So you'll notice that his mana investment to deal with 2 of our Swift Spears is 3 mana across 2 different turns. And you'll also notice that he's Brainstorm locked right now, meaning you might have a hard time finding mana in the future. So this is an incredibly mana intensive play from him for the amount of mana he has available. And these Swift Spears are, again, going to be able to get in another 2 damage apiece in order to, or going to be able to get in another 2 damage apiece because of the Prowess trigger from Riftbolt, and because he probably doesn't have a way of dealing with the Swift Spears. So he is going to use Force of Will, and he's going to pitch an Accumulated Knowledge to counter this Riftbolt. I think that might be a little bit early of a Force of Will from him. Force of Will is basically always going to do the same thing, more or less. We're going to go ahead and throw in the Lava Spike. Chances are, because of that Brainstorm, he put another 1-drop on top of his deck to counter something like Lava Spike off the top. But we know that these Swift Spears are probably going to be able to get in for damage this turn before they get wiped off. So we might as well fire the Lava Spike off just to have Lava Spike do 2 damage rather than none at all, perhaps. So we'll go ahead and put him down to 3 this way. That turns any of our other burn spells off the top of our deck into lethal, basically. Price of Progress isn't lethal yet, but it will be lethal if he uses the fetch land. So I think that play was okay, just for getting him down to 3, basically. We see our opponent doesn't have another land in their hand. We'll go ahead and attack with our Swift Spears. It basically forces him into using his mana on this Engineered Explosives. It'll tap him out of a counter spell if we decide to go for it this turn. I think it's a little bit early to go for it this turn, since he does have 4 cards in hand. And Price of Progress isn't lethal itself. If Price of Progress is lethal, I think you could probably go for it, but it's kind of risky because they do have a lot of 2-drops in their deck. They usually have Snapcaster Mage, Predict, and Accumulated Knowledge is their 2-drops, as well as Counterspell. We will go ahead and throw out this Eidolon because we are kind of short on mana. We're not really going to be able to set up any sort of quick interaction very quickly, I don't think. Like, I guess we could wait around and maybe try to draw Lava Spikes or Lightning Bolts first and use those to trigger the counterbalance. But I think that we're fine just casting the Eidolon here. We're really far ahead. Eidolon is never going to be something that we can just do at instant speed. Getting him to use a Brainstorm here is fine as well. So he reveals Counterspell with Counterbalance, which is probably the worst reveal for us because that's a guaranteed, it's a Counterspell that can counter any of the things we're trying to do at any point in the game. So now that he's going to have Counterspell up at all times as well as Counterbalance, we kind of have to really slow down and just wait, play the waiting game, which we're fine with doing. He doesn't have any sort of pressure on us at all, and we've got 2 lethal sources of damage in our hand right now that he's played this other Tundra. So he runs out of Scalding Tarn, which is going to help him get some amount of value out of this Brainstorm or out of this Ponder. And no, I didn't say Beautiful Island twice. I watched through this recently to refresh myself, and I guess the chat doesn't clear itself after that. So he did choose to draw a card with Ponder. We'll be able to tell the contents of the top of his deck based on this fetch land, basically. There's not really a reason for him to... either way, like 3 is about the same as 2 at this point. The only difference is if I draw Eidolon again, he'll have to counter Eidolon basically if he decides to fetch a land here. So he's gonna use a Predict because he knows the top card of his deck with Ponder, and he's gonna use that to kind of draw a little bit deeper into his deck. There's some potential right here of saying, okay, let's just try to go for it right now. We could use Price of Progress and Fire Blast. He will have to use Scalding Tarn to fetch. There's a pretty good chance that whatever the top of his deck is probably just some sort of land that he doesn't want, or maybe it could just be like another engineered explosives that he runs main deck. Maybe it's another counterbalance. That counterbalance is probably the only other 2-drop. The price of progress that could get hit by the price of progress could get nailed by that he wouldn't want on top of his deck right now, basically. I guess he might also throw away like another predict or something like that for all I know, but I don't think it's worth going for it right now, is what I'm trying to say. I think we've got plenty of time. We can be as patient as we want. He's presented no sort of clock to us. We kind of just have to find a good time to fight on the stack. So we did draw the Eidolon that we were talking about. If he decides to use a fetch land at any point, he'll have to counter the Eidolon. The Eidolon will basically be a guaranteed 2 damage, more or less, unless he's able to play Jace and just like bounce it. So we draw Lightning Bolt, which is good. We're just building up our hand here, getting ready to find a time to fight. Draw another Fire Blast, which is fine. We're actually getting pretty close to being able to just hard cast Fire Blast and not have to sacrifice any lands. And we're just passing back and forth, just making land drops, building up our hands, basically. Our opponent's going to have to discard here. They discard Terminus, which is good. Terminus is one of the ways they can use Brainstorm to counter Fire Blast when they have a counterbalance in play, so we're perfectly fine with them discarding a Terminus. They could also just have another Terminus in hand already, and they really just don't think they're going to need 2 Terminuses at any point. Terminus is a way they can deal with Eidolon the Great Revel without having to take any damage. We're just going to keep drawing lands. That's fine. We've got plenty of cards in hand. Basically, any of our cards are lethal at this point if they resolve, minus Eidolon. Our opponent's going to go for a Brainstorm here. And I think at this point, we can go ahead and try to start fighting. The reason I think we can go now is if they decide to Brainstorm again, in order for the first Brainstorm to be good, they're going to have to use a fetch land. And when they use a fetch land, that's going to put them down to lethal Eidolon range, basically, to where Eidolon is going to have to get countered as well. Also, in response to the first Brainstorm, Brainstorm is a card they're typically going to be using to activate Counterbalance, right? So if they have cards in their hand that they don't really want right now, that might not do anything, and maybe they're looking for extra counterspells or extra counter magic right now, we might as well just start throwing damage at them before they can find those cards that can maybe help them out. Their hand might be kind of mediocre right now. They might be looking for a clock, and you could use that argument as well of saying, well, their hand might be great, but maybe they're just looking for a way to kill us. And I think that's fine. But I think that it's probably fine to start going after them right now. So we're going to fire off the Lightning Bolt at first, see what's on top of Counterbalance. No real preference on which one you fire off, I guess. You could have gone with Fire Blast first, decided to go with Lightning Bolt. Luckily, he blind flips a counterspell, so that Brainstorm would have found him another counterspell. So we're going to go ahead and just throw the Lightning Bolt at him. This will provoke a response from him. He has to either Force of Will this or counterspell this. And if he Force of Wills this, he'll have to crack both of his fetch lands to be able to use his counterspell if he pays the full price on Force. So he's going to go ahead and use the counterspell right now. In response to this counterspell, before it resolves, I think that we want to continue fighting on the stack because we don't want the counterspell to resolve and them to have the ability to Snapcaster back the counterspell. So we'll cast Fire Blast. Our opponent's going to Brainstorm again in response, possibly to put a Terminus on top of their deck. So in response to that, we're just going to go ahead and Fire Blast on top. And now they either have to Force of Will or use another counterspell, which we already know there's one on top of their deck, and now they've just fetched it away. They're going to use the counterspell or counterbalance to see if there's a Terminus on top. There's a Snapcaster Mage on top. So it's looking pretty good for us, and we end up getting there. Alright, and if you don't want to know the outcome of this match, please look away right now. I don't think I'm able to to pause when I'm recording with Streamlabs. Just a second, and we're good. Okay. So let's look at the sideboard real quick. So cards we took out were Price of Progress. It can either be really good or kind of awkward. I think that it's maybe fine to leave it against the blue-white-red version, but a lot of the times they're not going to need red, I would think, after sideboard. So I could see them, you know, just fetching blue and white most of the time. There's going to be instances where it's great. There's going to be instances where it's bad, and I'd rather just have the guaranteed damage. We took out the 2 Searing Bloods as well. The cards we brought in were 2 Pyrostatic Pillars, the 2nd Exquisite Firecraft, and 2 Sulfuric Vortexes. Another great hand. We've got 2 recurring sources of damage with Swiftspear and Pyrostatic Pillar. Pyrostatic Pillar being probably the most important card for us to resolve. Our opponent has mulliganed to 6. They decided to keep that hand, and they also put a card on top of their library. They've led off with Tundra, and they're casting a Portent. Not a lot that we can tell from this Portent right now. They might be land light. They might just want to look at the top of their deck and make sure that they're drawing something well so they can fetch next turn and just, you know, get whatever the card they need off the top of their deck before they decide to fetch the 3rd card away, basically. We're going to obviously cast Swiftspear here. Go ahead and swing in for some damage. And they've put a Volcanic Island into play, and now this is the time where you can see where Price of Progress would be pretty good. So we're not going to cast anything. It's pretty obvious they probably have Counterspell in hand. If they decide to Swords to Plowshares, the Swiftspear, there's a pretty good chance we just resolve Pyrostatic Pillar. If they decide to resolve it now and kill the Swiftspear after it's done damage, that's fine. Swiftspear has done 2 damage for 1 mana, which is okay in this matchup. That would be the worst case outcome of our plan there, and even then the worst case outcome isn't that bad. So we're going to go ahead and fire off the Lightning Bolt here. If he does have a Counterspell in hand, and he decides to counter this, that opens up our ability to land Pyrostatic Pillar next turn, assuming they don't have a Spell Pierce or a Spell Snare for some reason. And if they just take 3 damage, that's fine. We do lose a little bit of damage from the Prowess trigger, but I think it's so important that we resolve this Pyrostatic Pillar because it's going to be pretty hard for them to deal with, that I'd rather just have that be the case. So we draw a Goblin Guide. I'm going to go ahead and cast that before I show them I have the 3rd land. This might in some way make them decide to counter the Goblin Guide because I'm not giving them the full information of my hand. So now they might be thinking, okay, I can get away with Brainstorming here and counterspelling this because he might not have the 2nd land, and I don't need to worry about Pyrostatic Pillar this turn. I don't think that, you know, maybe that logic just doesn't matter. Maybe most Miracles players would just say, there's nothing I can really do. I just have to counterspell this because I don't have a Swords to Plowshares in hand, and I just can't keep taking this recurring damage. If he has Pyrostatic Pillar, he has it. But use the stereotype that a lot of burn players do things suboptimally to try to get yourself a few extra percentage points by playing into that stereotype a little bit. So he does have the counterspell for the Goblin Guide, and we're pretty glad that we didn't throw out this Pyrostatic Pillar. Now we can throw it out, trigger the Swiftspear, and we can go ahead and hit him for 2 damage with the Swiftspear. So Swiftspear has done 4 damage for 1 mana at this point. Pretty dang good. And this Pyrostatic Pillar will just win us the game unless they can answer it in some way. We've drawn the 3rd Fire Blast, which is certainly much worse than the 1st. And we're just going to go ahead and jam out the Flame Rift here. The main reason why is our hand is so awkward that we can't really sit around waiting for a counterbalance to come down. We just kind of have to get as much damage with either the Swiftspear or the Flame Rift as we can. Pyrostatic Pillar will hopefully make up for a lot of that damage, and I don't know if we're going to be able to just sit on our hands as much last game with triple Fire Blast in hand, because we'd have to have some pretty dang good draws off the top. We'd have to, without them like developing any sort of threat. Maybe I wasn't supposed to cast a Flame Rift there. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you would have waited on it. Given that I don't think that he has Swords to Plowshares in hand, it might be okay, but at the same time he Brainstormed, so who knows. And he is just going to end of turn tear the Pyrostatic Pillar, which kind of hurts. Oh, no, that's what I was doing. I was using Flame Rift saying if this resolves, and even if he does deal with Pyrostatic Pillar, Fire Blast becomes lethal. That's what I was doing. Okay, that makes sense. With the Prowess trigger, and if Flame Rift resolves, then we can just Fire Blast him at any point. That makes sense. Okay. And he decides to cycle Accumulated Knowledge at end of turn. Now if he uses a fetch land, any burn spell is lethal off the top of my deck as well. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. That's why I was casting the Flame Rift there. Cracks the Scalding Tarn, and decides to start putting out a threat. Whenever they're tapping 4 or more mana, you can pretty much assume that it's going to be a threat. 3 sometimes means that it's going to be like a Council's Judgment, but going ahead and tapping out for Baneslayer Angel, they have 2 cards in hand. I kind of misplay here. I probably should have just drawn my card before Fire Blasting. He's already played his land for the turn. There's no real reason for me to fire this Fire Blast off at him. His Baneslayer Angel doesn't have haste or anything like that, but it does have Lifelink, which is why he's deciding to play it now. He kind of is priced into putting out a card that can put some serious pressure on me and gain him a bunch of life. So even though we had the double Fire Blast in hand, it didn't end up mattering. Using the Flame Rift there was maybe a good choice, and we ended up being able to beat Miracles. So as I've said, there's a few cards that we want to take out against them and a few cards we want to bring in. Price of Progress would have ended up being really, really good there. It would have done in 6 damage for 2 mana had it resolved. I think it's still a fine card to take out. I think that Pyrostatic Pillar on average is going to be better. Sulfuric Vortex is usually going to be better. And the second Exquisite Firecraft is usually going to be better as well. Cards that are going to be bad are going to be cards like Searing Blood. You don't have to take them out, but in general, Snapcaster is going to be your only real target you can usually hit. Theoretically, if they do play a Monastery Mentor out on turn 3, you can nail it with Searing Blood if they don't have the Force of Will. In that case, it's pretty good, but short of a few corner case scenarios, Searing Blood is pretty bad. If they have Counterbalance out and you're trying to hit a Snapcaster Mage, it could be pretty bad as well. So it's not always a guaranteed way of dealing with some form of pressure from them. In that matchup in general, you have a lot of time to just kind of sit back and build up a hand. Don't freak out about Counterbalance. They do have a lot of 1-drops in the deck and a lot of 2-drops, so they do have a lot of ways of countering what we can do. But just realize when their Counterbalance is going to be less good, or when you can make it less good. A lot of times you can make it less good when they're casting a Brainstorm, because instead of them casting a Brainstorm in response to what you're doing, you're casting something in response to what they're trying to do on top of their deck. That would force them basically to use another Brainstorm inefficiently out of their hand, and they only have so many Brainstorms, you know. A lot of the time you can wait for them to tap out to do something. They do run Counterspell, so feel free to just go ahead and cast something when they have already tapped out to play a threat. If they're not putting any pressure on your life total, don't worry about anything they're doing, more or less, unless you think you can win a fight on the stack. Because in order to kill us, they have to do something pretty impressive that's usually very mana intensive, and a lot of times you can see it coming from a mile away if it's a Jace, you know. Other cards to consider making sure that you resolve. Make sure you don't cast your Exquisite Firecrafts if you don't have Spell Mastery. And if you can help it, make sure you try to resolve your Sulfuric Vortexes and your Pyrostatic Pillars. They have a really hard time dealing with those cards usually. Their main way of dealing with them is usually going to be something like Council's Judgment. But if they don't find those cards, these are basically guaranteed clock, and they're going to have to start tapping out a lot of the times on their turn in order to deal with it, and that will give you an opening to resolve a lot of your other spells through like a counter spell or forcing them to use like a force of will, pitching a card rather than just hard casting it. Anyways, I hope you guys found this video informational. I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on the Miracles matchup. Do you guys think it's ridiculously good for us in your experience? Is it about 50-50 if the Miracles player is really good? What cards do you recommend bringing in the sideboard? What cards do you like taking out? Yada, yada, yada. Hope you guys enjoyed watching this, and hope you guys have a good Thanksgiving. Thank you.